The Art Pod, in association with Red Mud Arts and the Ruth Smith Gallery.
Hello and welcome to The Art Pod with me, Ruth Helen Smith. Today I'm talking with Matthew Jones in his exhibition A Stone's Throw Away, which is the culmination of his time here on the Ruth Smith Art Residency. His work is made using encaustic and draws upon the landscape and our level of stewardship of it. Normally based in Texas, these works are all responses to his time here on Dartmoor. So I'm in the gallery with Texas-based artist Matthew Jones, and this is the last few minutes actually of his exhibition A Stone's Throw Away, which is a culmination of all the work that he's been making on his 2-week residency at the Ruth Smith Gallery. And Matthew, do you want to sort of, for the listeners, describe the work a little bit?
Of course. Yeah, so this is a collection of various landscape paintings, just trying to capture the feeling of the place, both in more of a literal, tactile sense, in just how I felt going around the various moors and little peaks and stuff, just trying to find what it felt like to be in this region, really capture that heart, and in some aspect try to reflect how I felt that these places were respected by the people.
And what I find so fascinating about that fact is that you've captured Dartmoor so well, and the coast. And you said this is your first time not only in England but in Europe. And it definitely feels almost like there's the is it the outsider eye where you see something really clearly because it's new and you see it just as it is, because they're all so they just all have exactly the feeling of Dartmoor, and that's been a comment a lot of people have made, which is pretty amazing to have achieved that in just getting to know it in 2 weeks.
That's probably part of it. I mean, I've never been in a landscape quite like this, but I grew up in a forested area, so going into the the densely forested areas of like Belle Reef or whatnot, is like that felt a little bit like a homecoming to me, because it's been, I'm not from Texas originally, but I've been working there for the last 10 years and from Ohio, so those wet, dense, mossy forests, like that resonates with a very deep part of my core, and so that felt familiar to me. But some of these more stony hills, it's like that's new to me. I mean, I'm familiar with mountains and other badlands and stuff like that, canyons and whatnot, but nothing quite like these unique rock features here. So that was a bit interesting too, and just trying to find like the right angle to best capture these little moments of discovery that I had going into there.
In fact, there's a really nice work that encapsulates that very well, because it's the exhibition poster, and the painting is called A Stone's Throw Away, and it's sort of looking through quite a thick hedgerow, and you can just see a tour through the twigs.
Like a large deposit of stone that was weathered over time to form a very jagged, almost mini mountain that's been like bent with the winds kind of facing over. So they come in all different shapes and sizes, but they're really interesting, kind of like a small collapsed mesa almost. I think they're fascinating. It almost feels like it's pretending to be a mountain, and so from the right frame of reference, it can become a mountain for you in these paintings. And so, I mean, the Stone's Throw Away you're talking about, it's like we're peering through this hedge at this, toward the distance. And I've got a sort of a low resolution image of that, so it's like if you're not thinking about it, it's like maybe that is a weird mountain peak in the distance, not just a pile of stone 100 or so yards ahead of me.
Yeah, exactly. That's very true. So we're talking about these works as paintings, which they are, but we've just had a mini conversation just before recording that they're paintings that don't use any paint, which is intriguing, and your process is very interesting. So do you want to unpack a bit about encaustic?
Yeah, encaustic. That's what she's getting at. So this is a very unusual painting method. We're not painting with oil. We're not painting with tree sap for watercolor or egg for tempera. This is painted with molten wax. And the reason why she's saying it's not really paint, because it doesn't remain liquid as I'm working with it. since it's just hot wax that's been pigmented, as soon as I put my brush into my pot of wax and I lay it down on my board, it hardens immediately, because it's not about it drying, it's about it cooling, which is, in most conditions, instant. So building up a regular painting surface with this material is very alien if you're used to the fluidity of oil or even acrylic for that matter.
I can certainly vouch for that. Matthew very kindly gave us a workshop as he's leaving a lot of the equipment behind, so we're going to put that in the library of things in the town so people could sort of have a go themselves. But it was very peculiar, sort of expecting to do a nice fluid brush stroke and you get about an inch long and then it's just sort of stuck to the... So it is interesting, this kind of slow building up of drips and touches and beeswax.
But it's not even that slow because it goes on very, very thick.
That is true,
It's
yeah.
like you can't really thin it like you can oil painting. You can put a bunch of thinner and just have like an absolute wash of that. You can't do that with encaustic. Every brush stroke is relatively thick. Even if you let it cool to the point where it starts to pebble on you, you don't really get a small amount of paint. It's a large amount of paint, so you can build your surface relatively rapidly. I guess the trick for that is if you want something very thin, controlled, and smooth, well then you've got the hassle of scraping down all of your marks to get kind of shape it to what you want. But this, of course, this work doesn't really care about that. We're embracing that texture in all of its grittiness.
Exactly, yeah. And talking of texture, it's not just the texture of the wax in these works, is it? Because you've been also incorporating moss.
Yeah, there were a couple of reasons why I did that. One, I was aware a little bit of Dartmoor's history because it's among other things, it's a major source of peat, which is basically moss which has sunken into the ground and been completely submerged, and it's just this biocarbon trap that has been harvested and used historically as an alternative fuel source. And I guess if you leave it alone long enough, I mean millions of years, it turns to lignite coal, which is quite fascinating. But it's a really interesting organic material, which is not unique to Dartmoor per se, but it's a big part of its identity. And I wanted to work with a material that related back to the identity of the place I was using. So we say that I'm using moss in this, but in most of the work the moss is completely invisible. It's used as a structural aid to the wax itself when I'm trying to really build off the surface. Some of these pieces, well, most of them have some kind of relief element to them. The way I work with the wax, I intentionally go that direction. You don't have to, but that's the way I want to work. But some of them I'm going off the page a good ½ inch, I think, and one of them I'm good, well, that piece by the door there, perspective matters. I'm going a good 1.5 inches off the surface. And that's because I'm using the moss as a stabilizing agent. The fibers in the moss are helping to hold the wax in place as I'm going that far off my support. Kind of like how a sculptor would use burlap or plaster to give it more structural integrity as he's going off of his form.
And we should mention at this point as well the lovely small charcoal drawings that you've made of Dartmoor as well. They're absolutely beautiful, and the support that you've made for them is carved with this paper that you've made yourself on top, and then the drawings on top of that. And this paper is a very textured, sort of light browny grey colour.
It's not a consistent brown.
No, it's a really soft colour. And do you want to explain a bit about how you've incorporated moss into the paper itself? Yeah,
so once again returning to moss and me wanting to use material related to that, I knew that since I only had a short amount of time, I wanted to, one, diversify the scale and the kind of work that I was doing, but in order to keep it on theme of doing something about Dartmoor's history, I prepared the paper ahead of time using some of the moss, some sorghum moss. So I just kind of prepped that, boiled it down broke down some of those fibers in order to grind it down into a paper pulp, and then I mixed that with some recycled cotton paper, which is a great stabilizer if you ever want to get into homemade paper making. So you throw a bit of that in any dumb clay material you're trying to grind into a pulp will have some better hold to it if you do something like that. But either way, it's about half recycled cotton board from museum scraps actually, And then also mixed in with the boiled down moss, which blended into this really interesting vapor. Because we've got that brown color came from the moss itself, because the cotton was, like white. And so the moss turned it brown, and there's also little like seed fibers and stuff that are still kind of coming through in certain areas. Most of it went through pretty homogeneous, but occasionally you find a little inclusion for something that didn't quite pulp down properly, which honestly just gives a little bit more character and life in the page.
Something else I'd like to ask you about is your work previously about a kind of stewardship of the landscape, and your works have often included little bits of litter and things that you found on your walks as a reflection on how we care for or respect our environments. And we were sort of interested in how you might kind of find Dartmoor, because you don't see so much litter on Dartmoor because it is just really vast and unpopulated. But given that you were interested in the moss and the peat, there are other ways in which the landscape is shaped by us and stewarded. It looks like a pristine environment, but actually a lot of the peatland is really degraded. Were you kind of aware of that as you went on your walks?
Yeah, it's just really interesting. This is a beautiful place. I did intend to try to find some of the old spots where peat had been harvested previously, and I got close to one. I understand a lot of my paintings I did of Sortentor, and that area had a history of trying to farm peat and sell it as a coal alternative, as a way of getting some economic revenue into the area. So I didn't find any very specific evidence of that, but from what I understand, they're just digging big random troughs into the ground, which eventually refill and convert out just sheep pastures. So I was likely treading over these old mining locations without really being able to distinguish where they are. I mean, there may have been some more obvious ones deeper in, which I didn't find, but I knew there was like a scar in the land somewhere from our previous needs, but I honestly couldn't find it. And the fact that I can't even find where it is, if I'm going out hiking around trying to find it, it's just kind of interesting how like the land is sort of covering that over again. And even if it's the environmental change, we're having some issues with the peat slowly drying out and releasing it. It feels like the land is moving on in its own direction. What that direction ultimately means for us is hard to tell.
I think you touched on something really interesting there, which is that while you were on Dartmoor, you kind of knew that there was this thing out there to keep an eye out for, like these scars, and you knew that there was this process happening with the peat being drained and then decomposing and releasing carbon. You couldn't see it, and you couldn't kind of point your finger and say that's it there. And I think that's actually a really interesting picture of just the climate crisis as a whole. I mean, often it boils up in really dramatic ways, and those things have been more frequent recently, but in terms of releasing carbon into the atmosphere, you can't really point at a cloud and say, oh look, there's more CO2 up there now. It does sort of speak to this invisible foreboding problem that we know is there, but it's difficult to kind of visualise in the day-to-day. But I'm looking at one of the little charcoal drawings, and I think that captures that quite well because of the it's got a tour in the background, there's Dartmoor scrub, and then there's a sheep skull in the foreground. And of course a lot of these peat areas were drained in order to, quite recently actually, I think actually even post-war, drained in order to graze sheep. And there's just this sort of, that's the nearest you get to litter in any of these paintings. There's a little sheep skull, which you put next to you because you brought home. That's very nice. It's a very nice colour.
We found almost no litter when I was hiking through the fields and stuff like that. A tiny bit in the Bellevue forest. We picked up a couple of dog bags that had been left behind.
Oh, thank you.
And a couple of discarded coffee cups. But that was near the entrance. Going through the trail and off the trail, I did not see anything of the sort. So that was fascinating. I can tell you right now that is not the case in America. Well, actually, the national parks are pretty good.
Yeah, I'm sure it
but
depends on.
the state parks, less managed, and of course the local parks are just a dump for teenage negligence.
And I suppose in terms of a visible human mark on the landscape, we are also sat right next to a whole series of charcoal drawings, larger charcoal drawings. You've got a real depth to the blackness of the charcoal and the sky and the grasses and the stones, with a bit of like highlights with the chalk where there's the lichen and the light's catching it and the light on the horizon. They're really, really beautiful. But they're stone circles.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a very, very old bit of humans leaving things behind.
Yeah, there's like a primal memory to some of these places, which is really interesting. I vaguely knew that I needed to go see something like this, but I went here on the recommendation of a gentleman who came in here and talked with me for a good 20-30 minutes about what I was doing and about wax specifically, because I guess he was another wax expert, so that was fun. But at a more technical level, not an artistic level. And he pointed out that I was capturing the essence of the morgue, except that I overlooked that really ancient connection with the past men and how they lived here versus what was the more natural elements. And so I didn't have a lot of time left in the day, but like I have enough daylight to visit one of these sites and try to capture something. So I got up to Score Hill, very, very challenging drive up to there, not because it was far away, just because it was an incredibly narrow road for several miles. But
especially for someone who's used to Texas-sized roads.
yeah. But yeah, so got there right at twilight, and so we had this really strong contrast. You know, the sun was not even visible anymore, just the afterglow above the horizon, and these really, really strong shadows just raking across the landscape with these stones just kind of standing sentinel. Bit of a magical moment. It's kind of funny because it is a big circle, big stone circle, kind of like Stonehenge, but you know, on a much smaller, more local scale. So I was very tempted to name these in some kind of bad joke relating to I found Stonehenge, this is it. But I'm like, no, I gotta be more tactful than that.
And they're so atmospheric. It's really magical to hear the light conditions that you saw it in, and the way you've drawn it isn't an exaggeration of that. It really was in that glooming. And that's fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me on your last few sort of hours left.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
It's really nice to spend the time with the work and talk about it, and it's been nice getting to know you and your work over the last couple of weeks. So thank you so much for coming to stay and doing the residency.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to The Art Pod with me, Ruth Helen Smith, and my guest, Matthew Jones. Next time, I will be talking with Australia-based printmaker Damon Kowalski at his solo exhibition during his time on the Ruth Smith Art Residency. I do hope you will join me.
That was The Art Pod, in association with Redmud Arts and the Ruth Smith Gallery. Recorded on location at the Ruth Smith Gallery and the Clearwater Studios, Devon.